Happy Hanukkah, even more importantly, Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to all of you. We're glad to have you here on our Erev Shabbat service, our evening Shabbat evening service, Friday evening this time, and during the festival of Hanukkah, Festival of Lights. So today I would like to begin the message. I was thinking about talking about Hanukkah, and I've done that in the past, and you can read about Hanukkah in numerous places. Yeshua kept Hanukkah. He was in the temple on Hanukkah. I think that's John 20. There are other references to things that, regarding that time. I think I'm going to go somewhere else today. It's also another very important event right now. We got three important things going on right now. It's Hanukkah, yeah. It's a Shabbat, but it's also the annual Shabbat. And the annual Shabbat is called the Year of Release, or the Shemitah Year. And the Hebrew release is Shemitah. So this is right now the annual Shabbat and the weekly Shabbat, and this is the seventh year, the Shemitah Year. So it's kind of a special Hanukkah in that sense, in that it's nested among two Sabbaths at the same time there. In Genesis chapter 1, I'd like to begin the message today back in Genesis chapter 1, and I'm just going to give you some highlights. I in no way intend this message to be considered at all exhaustive. It's actually just the opposite. It's just an appetizer to kind of whet your appetite, so to speak. And I would rather encourage people to think. I would rather encourage people to study into these matters themselves rather than go into an exhaustive list of facts and scriptures and just really hit it heavy. I think it is a very important time. And so I'll begin right now in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 14 with that thought in mind, that this is not exhaustive. It's not the final word, but it is in hope that it will encourage you to study and look into these matters further. In verse 14 of Genesis 1 and verse 14, and the previous verse, the evening and the morning were the third day, now begins the fourth day. And so Elohim said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of the heavens, so meaning the stars also, meaning of these two lights, they were not referred to as stars. The only other lights we have in the heavens that are not referred to as stars, obviously, are the sun and the moon. So just obviously, I think everybody knows that, but I just want to clarify. God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth. And obviously, that's what the sun does. It gives the light to the earth. And the moon does as well, since it reflects the light of the sun for the evening, for the nighttime. You get outside one of those nights when there's no moon, and wow, it is really dark. But even the stars give light. If you go out on the night and there's no moon and it's pretty dark, but if you got a clear sky, you can still see things. You can see trees, and you don't have the detail, but you can see shapes and cars and stuff like that. If the cloud cover stops the light of the stars from reaching the earth, and there's no moon, it's like being in a cave. It is absolutely pitch dark. So there's lesser light in the night, but there is light, and so that's referred to in verse 16. God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth and to rule over the day and over the night, to divide the light from the darkness, and God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the fourth day. Now, as we begin this message and we start thinking about signs, I gave a message, I don't know, a few months back, and I talked about the blood moons that were coming up. I talked about the eclipse and as signs to watch, as warning signs, not to predict anything, not to say this is the end or to make any kind of a prediction at all, other than to realize that they are given to us for signs to watch of impending change, important events could be foretold. Something doesn't always happen every time there's a blood moon or a solar eclipse. Not at all. But very often, significant things are preceded by these heavenly signs. So some have discounted, these signs, the blood moons and such, because, they're only visible. I mean, I can't even tell you how many people have pointed out to me, do you realize, on these calendars it talks about the blood moon? Well, do you know that you can only see that blood moon from this area on the earth or from that area on earth? And, part of the time it's only visible out in the ocean, and the other part of the time it's only on this continent. Or I've had others say to me, well, how can that be? How can these things be a sign? People are going about their business. They realize it's just a natural event. Eclipses are a natural event. Lunar eclipses and solar eclipses, they happen from time to time. People don't consider it a sign. How can that be a sign from God or considered a warning or anything like that? People don't even know it. I've had that brought to my attention several times. If somebody blows a trumpet and you ignore it, it doesn't mean the trumpet wasn't blown. If somebody blows a trumpet and you don't know what it means, that doesn't mean the trumpet wasn't blown. So I understand that solar eclipses and lunar eclipses are only visible from certain parts of the earth. That's the nature of solar eclipses and lunar eclipses. Of course, there is no eclipse that is ever visible from the whole earth, lunar or solar. It's only in certain areas that it can be seen, because the angle that you look at, changes. And further away you get, it becomes a partial eclipse, and to the point where it's, is not even an issue anymore. So I understand that. I get it. I really do. I get it. So I get, people telling me that. I get emails. I understand. I get it. But please, let's be careful as we make up the rules. Because, such things, hey, we're making up the rules. These are the rules that we are going to make up. But we don't get to make up the rules of what is considered a sign. God does. And let him with ears to hear, let him hear. And let him with eyes to see, let them see. Not everybody was intended to see everything. Not everybody was intended to hear everything. That's what Messiah said. God says that the sun and the moon were given for appointed signs. Now, in the context when he says that, let's just take for a second and look at this again in verse 14. Genesis 1 and verse 14. God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons." So God just said that we're going to put these lights, the greater for the day and the lesser for the night, the sun and the moon. We're putting them in the sky, and they are for signs and seasons and days and years. So the same sun that's used to mark off years is used to mark off heavenly signs. The same moon that marks off each month that we see day in and day out, it's pretty regular. We don't look at it and get all alarmed and freak out. Hey, there's the moon. It is also given for signs, for seasons. God said that. Now, he doesn't say, let them be for signs and seasons when they're viewed by everybody on earth. It doesn't add those kind of clarifiers, and sometimes we want to add those clarifiers because it makes more sense to us. It's more logical. Okay, I can understand that. I'm just saying that's not what the Bible says. I mean, I'd like it to be a solar eclipse that the whole world saw at the same time. So we could say, whoa, that is an absolute miracle. But you know what? The Bible says that it's a miracle when it's just an eclipse. I'm going to show you that. Okay? In Hebrew, the word for seasons, the Hebrew word is ot, and it means an appointed time or an appointed place, an appointed season, an appointed meeting, an appointed signal, an appointed sign. I mean, that's just the literal meaning of the word seasons there, that Hebrew word that's translated as seasons in our New King James Bibles. Now, the word signs, in the Hebrew, that's moed, and that means literally a sign, a signal, a mark, a miracle. That word means miracle or an omen. That's just the meaning of the word. So it says, now with that understanding in mind, God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for miracles, signals, marks, and omens, and for appointed times and places, for appointed signals and appointed signs. An appointed meeting, it's like, let's get together. When? Well, there's an appointed time. Remember, in the Bible, God says that He declares the end from the beginning. We like to think of things lineally, what's going to happen next. I don't know. Do you know what's going to happen next? No. And people will say, the only one who would know that would be God Himself. That's correct. God Himself does know. He is the one who appointed the end from the beginning. God knows. And so He gives us appointed times when He's telling us about things, stuff's going to happen. That's kind of what it's saying here. It's also to point out appointed times. Yeah, it tells you when the holy days are. Sure, I understand that. But it tells you a lot more than when the holy days are. And that same word is even used for once when Israel was going to make a signal. They wanted to make a signal so that, they were going to divide the army. And so they said, well, when we set the city on fire, the smoke will be the sign, the signal. It's the same word. You'll see the smoke and you'll say, that's it. So the word's used that way. Now, according to the sages of the Talmud, solar eclipses were warnings for the world. Because a solar eclipse is, the whole world goes by the sun. But lunar eclipses were primarily warnings for Israel, because Israel used the moon to associate with its calendar. It's a lunisolar calendar, a combination of the moon and the sun. So I'm going to actually just read. There's this book here, actually. There's a couple of different books I would recommend. But one is The Mystery of the Shemitah. Some of you have already have this book. I've already read it. And I would recommend reading it. I really would. It's a fantastic book, and it's documented, okay? It's documented. So nobody's trying to predict anything here. But when you see something, if you don't say, hey, take notice, I think that's kind of foolish. So that's all I'm saying is take notice. Maybe something really significant is about to take place, and when you look at the world, it's like, duh. So, okay? That's what this is about. But I'm going to read a little bit just briefly here because I could get the Talmud. I have a copy of the Talmud. But, he quotes it out of here, and I'll just save the time of looking it up from the Talmud, quoting it there. But it's from the Talmud. It's Sukkah 29a, if you want to take a note. Sukkah 29a. And I'm actually just going to quote out of the epilogue of the book Shemitah, The Mystery of the Shemitah by Jonathan Cahn. It's an excellent book. And anyway, quoting from the Talmud, he quotes, "Our rabbis taught when the sun is in eclipse, it is a bad omen for the entire world. Our rabbis taught when the sun is in eclipse, it is a bad omen for those who worship idols. But when there is an eclipse of the moon, it is a bad omen for Israel, since Israel reckons time by the moon and those who worship idols by the sun." There's a certain logic to that, I understand that's kind of interesting. But you know what? The Talmud is not a source that I use to set doctrine by or beliefs. It's something that I use to augment, or it's interesting additional information. The Bible is the source. That's the foundation. That's what really matters. So let's look in the Bible and see if the Bible uses these things to mention as signs, like it mentions there in the Talmud that they do. Let's go and begin here in Joel chapter 2. Joel chapter 2 and verse 10. Joel chapter 2 and verse 10, it says, "The earth quakes before them, the heavens tremble, the sun and the moon grow dark, and the stars diminish their brightness." So here we obviously have a reference. Thank you for my tea there. We obviously have a reference. The sun and the moon grow dark as a heavenly signs that's associated with that great and terrible day of Yahweh, verse 11, right? Yahweh gives voice before his army. His camp is great. Strong is the one who executes his word. For the day of Yahweh is great and very terrible. Who can endure it? So to mark this, God says the sun and the moon will grow dark. Now, let's look again. We'll just drop down a few verses, pick it up in verse 30. Same chapter, Joel 2, verse 30. "And I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke." Now I think it's called an annular eclipse, which is called kind of a fire eclipse. It's a total solar eclipse. It blocks out the sun completely. The moon gets between the earth and the sun, and it blocks the view of the sun completely. But depending on how close the moon is to the earth, if the moon is further away from the earth, then it gets a little bit smaller, and that's when the moon gets between the earth and the sun, and it blocks out most of the sun. But the sun is still big enough to where there's just a real thin line of fire that you can see, and all you see is a black spot with just fire all the way around it. That's called, if I'm pronouncing it right, an annular eclipse. And they're quite spectacular. So keeping that in mind, and then like it says in Revelation, the moon will become like blood. It uses the word like blood. I think we understand the moon will be turned into blood doesn't mean that it's actually going to go from being made out of minerals and rock and whatever, the dirt that's made out, that it's going to become a floating orb 1/3 the size of the earth of just a big blob of blood, gooing around. It's communication, it's metaphor language and a metaphor. It's going to be bloody looking, it's going to be red. And so it will be like blood, like it says in the book of Revelation, and fire, So, the sun already is fire. Is there anything new about that? And, so look at the words again and consider. The sun will be turned into darkness, verse 31. Joel 2:31. And the moon into blood before the coming, and it will come to pass. Oh, sorry, I started one verse too late. I meant to read verse 30. Try it again. Joel 2:30. "I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood." Well, we have blood moons. As a matter of fact, we have a series of 4 blood moons coming. One has passed already, actually, and no, I think two have passed. Just recently, we have one more coming. That's, I think, isn't it around Pesach, I think, on the first day of Matzah, and then the last one will come on the first day of Sukkot. So those two blood moons will both be in the Shemitah year. Also, we have an eclipse coming, a solar eclipse coming on March 20th that is also in the Shemitah year. So when we think about the blood moons, as they call them, because, the red tone that the bloody-looking tone, or the red tone that the moon will pick up, they call them blood moons. So blood and fire, well, an annular eclipse is going to look like fire, since we're talking about the moon and the sun. Perhaps that's what it's referring to here in verse 30, right? Blood and fire. I mean, maybe there's going to be, wars, there's going to be blood spilled, and there's going to be smoke and fires, But maybe it's referring to the view of the solar, the moon and the sun, since that's what it's talking about. The moon is going to be turned into darkness. Well, it makes it look blood red. And the fire, well, an annular eclipse will look like fire. So just consider it, okay? That's all. Let's go back to Joel again, now this time in chapter 3. Joel 3 and verse 11. Assemble and come, all you nations, and gather together all around. Cause your mighty ones to go down from there, O Yahweh. Let the nations be wakened and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, go down, for the winepress is full and the vats overflow. Their wickedness is great. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of Yahweh is near in the valley of decision, and the sun and the moon will grow dark. That's kind of interesting, that word grow dark. To grow is a process. Grow isn't something that just like instantly happens. You follow what I'm saying? The words are there for a reason, so that we understand how it's going to happen. It's not like, zing, just blink and it's dark. They grow dark. Eclipses grow dark. That's what they do. Now, you could say it can happen by another means without it being an eclipse. Okay, fine, I agree, it could. And God can do anything, and he has. But back in Genesis chapter 1, God did say that one of the things he was going to do with the sun and the moon is cause it to grow dark from time to time as a sign. So the sun and the moon will grow dark, and the stars will diminish their brightness. That could be, atmospheric disturbance causing the brightness to diminish of the stars, or God could actually just tone them down. That's up to him. But here we have, again, the sun and the moon associated with major events. And the association is described in language that is fulfilled by eclipses. And if you want to say, well, it's going to be another way, that's fine. But technically, it's fulfilled by the eclipses. Okay, that's my point. Technically, it's fulfilled. If you want to say it's going to be fulfilled another way, those are your rules and your beliefs, and maybe you're right. Because it doesn't say it won't be fulfilled another way. I'm just saying technically it is fulfilled through the eclipses. Okay, that's all I'm saying. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 13. Isaiah 13 in verse 9. Isaiah 13, verse 9, and it says, Behold, the day of Yahweh comes, cruel, with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he will destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. Now, what does its belong to? Is the moon's not going to shine, or it's not going to cause its light to well, the moon's light is the sun. So if the sun's dark, the moon's not going to be shining. That's the way it works. Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24. So the rabbis, in their commentary, maybe they add a little bit more because they talk about, the lunar for the Israel and solar for the world. But there's a certain logic to what they said. But let's continue on here. Matthew 24 and verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. There we are again. The stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heaven will be shaken before the sign of the Son of Man appears. So we have references after reference after reference of these events involving the sun and the moon, preceding major events in the world. It's kind of interesting. Let's go to Revelation chapter 6. Revelation chapter 6, and we will begin in verse 12. It says, I looked, and when he opened the sixth seal, behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood. Now, this is a very specific description here, and this is an interesting one, because here it says that the sun will become black, and the moon will become like blood. Well, you think about the moon, its light is a reflection of the sun. If the sun's black, you're not going to have any light reflecting on the moon, unless maybe it's only black from your view, but the moon's got plenty of it. But if you have a total solar eclipse, then, a solar eclipse, then the moon is blocking the sun, and the sun goes black. But the moon is visible, and it looks bloody red. So, anyway, that's just something to consider. We have March 20th, we have a solar eclipse, which is Adar 29. I know what day it is because I found out it's my birthday. It's like, okay, that's interesting. So that's my birthday. Anyway, Revelation 6, and it doesn't mean anything. I'm just kind of freaked me out, that's all. Revelation 6 in verse 12. So the moon became like blood, and the stars of the heaven fell to the earth as a fig tree drops its late figs when it's shaken by a mighty wind. Then the sky receded as a scroll when it's rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place, and the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave, every free man, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks and in the mountains, and said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come. So right before the great day of his wrath, we have something here that is technically, completely fulfilled in a solar eclipse followed by a blood moon, which we have the solar eclipse on March 20th. I think it's 2 weeks later we have a blood moon on first day of Passover, right, or Pesach, or first day of Matzah. So 2 weeks later we have a blood moon. So I'm not saying that's the beginning of the tribulation. I'm just saying it's an important event to take note of. It's something that God says is a sign that we should at least consider. So now let's see some of these signs in historical application. Okay, we've read biblical passages, but let's look at some historical applications. The last time that's good. The last time this same sequence happened of 4 blood moons in a row, each falling on high days, holy days, God's feast days. The last time that sequence happened was in the 1967-68 when Israel recaptured Jerusalem in the Six-Day War. Before that, it was in the 1940s when Israel was born. It didn't happen in the 1800s. It didn't happen in the 1700s. It didn't happen in the 1600s. It didn't happen in the 1500s. It did happen in 1493 when the Jews were expelled from Spain. So it's kind of interesting. Historically, these types of solar eclipses have been signs that have foretold important events, such as the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Right before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, there were 2 solar eclipses in a row. They were also on feast days, just like they are this year. About 8 months before the temple was destroyed, we find on October 18th of the year 69 AD, there was a partial lunar eclipse on the festival of Sukkot, and a total solar eclipse followed on Nisan, which is the beginning of the religious year, in 70 AD. And then 2 weeks later, again, they had another lunar eclipse on Passover that year. And then an annular solar eclipse followed this on Rosh Hashanah in 70 AD. So we have the same thing happen there, a series of solar eclipses and lunar eclipses right at the 78. Coincidence, I'm sure. Or maybe it was a sign. We understand what happened then, right? The temple was destroyed. That was a horrible time. A lot of people died, Masada, it was a horrible, horrible time. But people ask, well, what about the Christians? What about the church? What about the believers in Yeshua? Well, at that time, Christians were mostly Jews, and those in Jerusalem were certainly mostly Jews. So, because the believers were Jews, mostly, for the first 100 years or so. And so, let's see what happened. I'm going to quote from Josephus here, Wars of the Jews. Wars of the Jews, Book 6, sections 2 and 3, I'm quoting from. Josephus, about this event in 70 AD. Now there was then a great number of false prophets, suborned by the tyrants to impose upon the people, who denounced this to them, that they should wait for deliverance from God, and this was in order to keep them from deserting. He goes on in section 3 here, says, thus were the miserable people persuaded by these deceivers, and such as belied God himself, while they did not attend nor give credit to the signs that were so evident, and did so plainly foretell their future desolation, but like men infatuated without either eyes to see or minds to consider, did not regard the denunciations that God made to them. Thus there was a star resembling a sword, which stood over the city, and a comet that continued for a whole year. Thus also before the Jews' rebellion and before those commotions which preceded the war, when the people were in great crowds to the feasts of unleavened bread, and on the 8th day of the month of Nisan, and at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone around the altar in the holy house that it appeared to be bright daytime, which light lasted for half of an hour. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend to those events that followed immediately upon it. He goes on. So Josephus records heavenly signs at that time. We know historically, I mean, you can just do a Google search and find out that there were eclipses, lunar and solar, several in a row, just like we have this year, right at 70 AD. It's kind of interesting. I'm going to quote just a little bit from this book of Eusebius, The History of the Church. Eusebius, I'm just going to quote, let's see, it's what's chapter? This is chapter 4, section 11, the Eusebius, The History of the Church. It's talking about Vespasian, after his dazzling success in the campaigns against the Jews, was proclaimed emperor. This is about the time of 70 AD, by the way. So more historical information about that. His campaigns against the Jews, was proclaimed emperor while still in Judea, after being hailed as imperator by the armies there. He at once set out for Rome, entrusting the war against the Jews to his son Titus. He goes on, while the remaining apostles, in constant danger from murderous plots, were driven out of Judea, but to teach their message they traveled into every land in the power of Christ, who had said to them, "Go and make disciples of all nations in my name." Furthermore, the members of the Jerusalem church, by means of an oracle given by revelation to an acceptable person there, was ordered to leave the city before the war began, and they settled in a town of Perea called Pella. To Pella, those who believed in Christ migrated from Jerusalem, as if holy men had utterly abandoned the royal metropolis of the Jews. In the entire Jewish land, the judgment of God at last overtook them. Anyway, so here we have interesting facts. Josephus talks about warnings. We have Eusebius talking specifically about the church getting warnings. And so they have a combination of what he called suitable people, suitable men to warn the church, accompanied by, they had solar eclipses, they had lunar eclipses, they even had the comet that stayed up there and a star that was shaped like a sword. Heavenly signs. There are others have spoken about these things. I would expect us to have heavenly signs again before major events. I would totally expect that. Now, what's, to me, exceptionally interesting at this time is when we see the signs in the heavens during a historic time of judgment. When I say a historic time of judgment, I'm referring to the Shemitah year. So we have kind of a compilation of things here. We have the signs in the skies, 4 blood moons, and I think 2 solar eclipses happening on high days in succession like that, happening in the 7th year, which is the Shemitah, which the word Shemitah means to let loose, to let it fall. To release, we say release. You're released of your debts. That's right, you're released. But it also, in the Hebrew, it's like not English. In the English, we want to say release, and that's it, stop. No, it's a Hebrew word. And it means to let fall, to let go, to release, to let it collapse. Just let it go. Whatever happens, happens. That's the meaning in the Hebrew. Release is only one of the meanings. So let's look a little bit about the Shemitah year now. Let's go back in Leviticus 25 and read just a little bit about that. Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 1. It says, Yahweh spoke to Moshe on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the eternal. 6 years you shall sow your field. 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruit. But the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the eternal. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. I have kept the the land rest or the seventh year Sabbath for my orchards, well, as long as I've had one. I've been letting my land rest on the seventh year for so long I just don't remember. Pretty much my whole adult life, and that's great. But you know what? It's not just about agriculture. I mean, when you look at Leviticus 25, clearly that's talking agricultural, right? Let your land rest. It talks about also making sure that the poor are cared for. Let's go to Exodus 23. Exodus chapter 23 and verse 10. It says, 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its produce, but the seventh year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field may eat. In like manner you shall do with your vineyard and your olive grove. Okay, then it says 6 days you shall do your work, and the seventh day you shall rest, right? So it's a Sabbath rest. Just like we don't get to choose which day is the Sabbath, we don't get to choose which year is the Sabbath year. The seventh year, the Shemitah. But here we see now it's starting to reach beyond agriculture. So we let the land rest. We don't prune our orchard. We don't till the soil and try to demand that it yield to us. Every year we give it that year off on the land rest year, the Shemitah, the Sabbath year. So that's agricultural. But then it begins to talk about the poor, to take care of the poor and even the animals. Okay, well that's, it's still kind of agricultural, but when you start taking care of the poor, now it's starting to be a little bit economic as well. It's okay, it's agricultural caring for people. That's fine. Now let's go to Deuteronomy, because there's so much more to it. Deuteronomy chapter 15. Deuteronomy chapter 15, and I will begin in verse 1. This is an appropriate thing to talk about right now because we are in the seventh year, and we'll be talking about it periodically throughout the year, finally culminating with the entire Torah being expounded, which takes place at the end of the seventh year. So that will be during the festival of Sukkot this year. That's when we'll do it. Deuteronomy chapter 15 and verse 1. At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release of debts. Well, at the end of every 7 years, the end of the year, you have the religious year begins with Nisan. Agriculturally, land rest, what's the right word? I don't know, civil, the year begins. Otherwise, for counting the holy days, Nisan is the beginning of months. And people say, well, that's when the Bible says, and I understand that, and that's true. But the land rest doesn't go from Nisan 1 to Nisan 1. Okay? It goes from the festival of trumpets, Yom Teruah, through Yom Teruah. I think we all understand that. I mean, it's in the Bible. It's pretty clear. Yom Kippur is when that great Jubilee is announced, which takes place also. And the trumpet is blown, not at Passover, at Yom Kippur, and the month is Tishri. Well, right before Tishri is, the month before Tishri, right, would be the 6th month. The 29th day of the 6th month is the last day of the year on this civil year, on this calendar that would count from land rest to land rest. Okay? So that's the day before trumpets, which is Tishri 1. Elu, I think it's called. So at the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release of debts. That is not agricultural. That's economic. This is the form of the release. This is the form of the Shemitah. This is how it's going to fall. Fall is one of the meanings of the word Shemitah. This is how it's going to come down. That would be a correct translation as well. Every creditor who has lent anything to his neighbor shall release it. Let it go. Let the debt drop. He shall not require it of his neighbor or his brother, because it is called the Eternal's Shemitah. So now we have an economic. And if you think about it now from an economic standpoint, you have a major economic situation here because you have massive debts being canceled. You have property changing place, changing ownership. On the Jubilee, the 50th year, otherwise you have people being forgiven of their debts. Debts are canceled. You have on your books, this is my income. I have X amount of money coming in. This is what people owe me. Here's over here what I owe others, whatever. And your balance sheet changes big time when people are keeping it. It's economic. It's not agricultural in this case. And it affects not just the poor. It affects the wealthy. And when you start looking at the ramifications of a society that stops maximizing its yield, because the produce of your land in the Hebrew, the word produce, the yield, we think again in English. And produce means, hey, it's my groceries. I'm talking tomatoes and carrots here. The Hebrew isn't so limited. The Hebrew word produce means yield, and it also includes things that are not agricultural. The land may yield to you its produce. Could be copper, nickel, iron, gold, silver, water, other stuff like that. Not just grapes and tomatoes and carrots. So when you actually look at the ramifications of not farming for a year, that's going to affect economically. I mean, what percentage of an economy is agriculture? I don't know. It's big business, I know that. Everybody's eating, right? But when you start to realize how it would affect the financial and the banking systems and everything else with the releasing of debt and the freeing, and then once every 7 cycles of 7, then even property is changing hands. It's an economic Shemitah that we're talking about, not just an agricultural Shemitah. Now let's look at a prophetic Shemitah, or Shemitah of judgment. Because the Shemitah year is either a year of blessings. If you keep it right, God says, I will command and you'll have so much, you'll still be eating the old produce when the new stuff comes on. You will not run out. You'll have extra. You'll have so much you won't know what to do. That's blessings. But it's also, if you're not in line and you're not close to God, and it's a time of judgment, and it's a scary time, and it's a hard time. I remember when I was a kid, our president was Jimmy Carter. Our nation was held hostage, right? The Iran hostage crisis. I mean, the younger people don't remember, but I remember. I hate being able to say that. It means I'm not a younger person anymore. I'm sorry to be able to say that. But it's true. I remember very well the early 70s. I remember how happy we were as a nation when we got a new president that we felt maybe would finally do something. And the whole nation was humiliated. I remember standing in lines to get my gasoline. Standing, I'd be in my car. And the big debate was, should you turn your engine off or let it run? Because you turn it off and then you start it because the next guy in front of you got filled up. You move forward. And we're talking lines that were 2-3 hours long, I mean, it was common to stand in line for 2 or 3 hours. It was not an exception. It was common. I used to take gallon jugs, milk jugs, and fill my trunk with them. So when I got my car full, fill up these little gallon jugs, my mom's milk jugs I saved so I could have a little extra gas. And how many times the gas pumps ran out when I was only a block away. I've been in this line for 2 miles, and I'm almost there. And then the guy comes out with the out of gas sign, and I go to the next station and sit in the line again. Yeah, it was a Shemitah year. It's a Shemitah year, I remember. Jeremiah 25. Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 4. Well, you know what? Never mind that. Let's go back to Leviticus. I want to read Leviticus first. I'll come back to Jeremiah. Let's go to Leviticus again, this time 26. Leviticus chapter 26. Sorry about that, making you run around in your pages there. Leviticus 26 and verse 31. Says, this is the blessing and cursings chapter, right? In verse 31, it says, I will lay your cities waste for the sins, right? And I'll bring your sanctuaries to desolation, and I will not smell the fragrance of your sweet aromas. And I will bring the land to desolation. Your enemies who dwell in it will be astonished at it. And I will scatter you among the nations and draw you a sword out after you. Your land will become desolate, and your cities waste. Then the land will enjoy its Sabbaths as long as it lies desolate and you're in your enemy's land. Then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. As long as it lies desolate, it shall rest. For the time it did not rest on your Sabbaths when you dwelt in it. So here we see Shemitah as being used as a period of judgment. Because, and the connotation is, the context is, that since you didn't let the land rest, then when I exile you out of the land, it's going to rest then. However many times you didn't let it rest, that's how many years I'm keeping track of it. There will be a reckoning. It's not we're just going to let it blow over and every once in a while. He's keeping track. That's interesting. Verse 35 there was very interesting. As long as it lies desolate, it will rest, for the time it did not rest on your Sabbaths when you dwelt in it. So it's connected as a time of judgment, as a time of punishment, the Shemitah. In this case, you being kicked out during a Shemitah year, so that it could rest on its Sabbaths. And I believe when it talks about, and for all this, if you do not repent, then 7 times more, 7 years more, that's talking about from one Shemitah to the next Shemitah. And I think if you look in history, I'm going to share a little bit about that with you pretty soon, they happen in 7-year cycles. That's from one Shemitah to the other. And if you still don't repent, 7 times more, 7 more years till the next Shemitah. Shemitahs are a time of judgment. Now we'll go back to Jeremiah 25 and verse 4. Jeremiah 25 and verse 4 says, Yahweh has sent to you all his servants, the prophets, rising early and sending them. But you haven't listened or inclined your ear to hear. And they said, Repent now, every one of his evil and his evil doings, and dwell in the land that Yahweh has given you. Repent. It's given you this land to you and your fathers forever and ever. Do not go after other gods to serve them and to worship them, and don't provoke me to anger with the works of your hands, and I will not harm you. And yet you have not listened to me, says Yahweh, and that you might provoke me to anger with your works, with the works of your hands, to your own hurt. Therefore, thus says the Yahweh of hosts, because you have not heard my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, says Yahweh, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, will bring them against this land, against its inhabitants, and against these nations all around, and utterly destroy them, and make them an astonishment, a hissing, and a perpetual desolations. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of mirth, and the voice of gladness, and the voice of the bridegroom, and the voice of the bride, and the sound of the millstones, and the light of the lamp. And this whole land will be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. And it will come to pass, when 70 years are completed, that I will punish the king of Babylon and the nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, says Yahweh, and I will make it a perpetual desolation. And so I will bring on that land all my words which I have pronounced against it, all that is written in this book which Jeremiah has prophesied concerning all the nations, for many nations and great kings shall be served by them. Also I will repay them according to their deeds and according to the works of their own hands. For thus says Yahweh Elohim of Israel, Israel to me, take this wine cup of fury from my hand and cause all the nations to whom I send you to drink it. And they will drink, and they will stagger and go mad because of the sword that I will send among them. And I took the cup from Yahweh's hand and made all the nations drink to whom Yahweh had sent me. Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, its kings and its princes, to make them a desolation, an astonishment, a hissing, and a curse, as it is to this day. Also Pharaoh king of Egypt, his servants and his princes and all his people, the mixed multitude of the kings of the land of Uz and the kings of the land of the Philistines, namely Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and the remnant of Ashdod, Edom and Moab and the people of Ammon. He goes on to list them. Second Chronicles 36. Second Chronicles. I'm not sure that was I wasn't really able to find the passage I really wanted in that last section, so I'm going to cogitate on that for a moment while I go to Second Chronicles. Sorry. Second Chronicles chapter 36. And verse 15. Okay, here we go. Verse 15, and Yahweh God of their fathers sent warnings to them by his messengers, rising up early and sending them because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God, and they despised his words, and they scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of Yahweh rose against his people, until there was no remedy. Therefore he brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on the young man, or the virgin, or the aged, or the weak. He gave them all into his hand. And all the articles from the house of God, great and small, and the treasuries of the house of the eternal, and the treasuries of the king and his leaders, all these he took to Babylon. And then they burned the house of God, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious possessions. And all those who escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons, until the reign of the kingdom of Persia. And this was done to fulfill, verse 21, it says, to fulfill the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah, until its land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. 70 years were proclaimed, remember? Daniel studied Jeremiah, and he was able to determine by the works of Jeremiah that it would be 70 years. That's because they had 70 land rest years that they had not, for 70 cycles of 7, they had not let the land rest. So they went into captivity for 70 years so the land could rest 70 years. The Shemitah year is used here, again, as a sign of judgment. And I think that's the point that I wanted to share with you, which is rooted from Leviticus 26, what we read just a little bit ago. Now, I don't have time left. I know I'm out of time, and I just want to mention a couple of things then before I close, because like I said, all I wanted to do is kind of encourage you to think. We have these blood moons, we have the solar eclipses, we have them falling in such a way that they can technically qualify as the heavenly signs that preclude other great events. I know we still have to watch for Jerusalem being surrounded by armies and the sacrifices being stopped. In order for the sacrifices to be stopped, they first have to be started. We have other things we're watching for, but some of them are beginning to appear as if some of it might be taking shape. It might be just something to take note of, to watch. Okay? No predictions on anything. This isn't about prediction. But I'd like to just share with you briefly from this book, The Mystery of the Shemitah by Jonathan Cahn. He talks about the crash of the year 2000, 2001, the dot-com crash, and 9/11. You remember 9/11, right? Shemitah Year. Yeah, as a matter of fact, there's a lot more to that, down to the day and even to the minute on many of these instances, when things happened, when the bombs dropped or the towers went up or when they went down. A lot of facts in here. The crash of 1916, 1917, the First World War, Shemitah Year. The crash of 1973, I just talked about that myself, Shemitah Year. You know, the crash of 1901, 1903, the Great Depression, 1937, 38, yeah, Shemitah. The Great Recession, that they call it, the crash of 2007, 2008, very recent, right? Shemitah Year. Yeah, Great Depression. And now for us, the Great Recession, all Shemitah years. You know, there are only, I think, 6 of these series of 4 blood moons, each following on Holy Day. 6 of them in the last 2,000 years. It's not something that happens all the time. I mean, they happen, but I mean, to have a series like that has only happened 6 times in the last 2,000 years. On 3 of those times were major events, like the Jews expelled from Spain, the 6-Day War, and what was the third one? I mentioned it earlier. I don't remember. Anyway, he mentions in here, I'll just read it. Oh, not there. I want to read over here. I'm going to read a little bit, and then I'll close. Page 81. Okay, here it is from page 257. On the epilogue, he says, the occurrence of 4 consecutive lunar eclipses, each on a Jewish holiday, has taken place only 6 times in the last 2,000 years. 3 of those times have been associated with pivotal events in Jewish history: the expulsion of the Jewish people from Spain, the rebirth of Israel, and the regaining of Jerusalem. Yes, the rebirth of Israel in the 40s, regaining of Jerusalem in the 6-Day War. And so that's pretty significant. Again, on the next page, he says, referring to the black sun and the Shemitah, the phenomenon of the black sun is not only connected to the tower, but on certain occasions to the Shemitah. The darkening of the sun has at times converged with the Shemitah's climactic end. This doesn't mean that an event of significance must occur at such a time. The convergence happened in 1959 with no apparent corresponding event of significance. I thought that was kind of interesting, so I thought I did a little research on 1959. It happened on my birthday that year, so I got 2 birthdays on these solar eclipses. That must mean that the warning to the world is they have to endure me for a while, I guess. On the other hand, when the sun is darkened at the time of the Shemitah's climactic end, it has more than once signified an event of great significance, and an event that just happens to take place in the same realm appointed by Scripture concerning the end of the Shemitah, the financial realm. In 1931, a solar eclipse took place on September 12th It happened at the end of the year of the Shemitah. On the Hebrew calendar, the eclipse took place on Tishri 1, the same day that ends the Shemitah, and that begins the moment of the Shemitah's climactic conclusion. At the sunset of Elul 29, the moment of financial nullification, that would be the instant before trumpets begins, right? The very end of that period. 8 days after the convergence, England abandoned the gold standard and set off a market crashes and bank failures throughout the world. And the darkening of the sun at the Shemitah's end exhausted in the greatest month-long stock market percentage crash in Wall Street history. In 1987, a solar eclipse took place on September 23rd. It happened at the end of the year of the Shemitah. It took place on the exact end of Elul 29. And they talk about that was the greatest black day, the greatest point drop in any single day took place at that time. So finally, closing is say the most of the coming Shemitah will take place in the year 2015. During that year, there will be 2 solar eclipses. The first will take place on March 20 on the biblical calendar up until sunset. March 20 is Adar 29. From sunset on, it's Nisan 1. It is the precise midpoint of the Shemitah year. Thus, the darkening of the sun will mark the beginning of the sacred year and Shemitah's exact center point. The second solar eclipse, as 2015, will take place on September 13. September 13 is Elul 29, again, the very day that constitutes Shemitah's climactic end, the day of nullification. As it did in September 1931 and again in September of 1987, it will fall on the Shemitah's climactic end. In the past, this ushered in the worst collapse in Wall Street history. What will it bring this time? Again, as before, the phenomenon does not have to manifest at the next convergence, but at the same time, and again, it is wise to take note. And I think that is the main point. I just would like to encourage people to just wake up, just take note. And so I'll close then with God's admonition in Jeremiah chapter 8 and verse 7. In Jeremiah chapter 8 and verse 7, Yahweh says, "Even the stork in the heavens knows her appointed times, and the turtle dove, the swift on the swallow, observe the time of their coming. But my people do not know the judgment of Yahweh." Well, God has told us, at least when we see these heavenly signs in the sun and the moon, that we should listen up. Look. It's a time of repentance. It's a time to draw close to God. It's a time to look in the mirror and look at yourself. Say, how am I doing? Wise up. Take note. It's not a prediction. It is a caution that God gives us out of love. Let's not ignore it.